The sun bled orange across the Mojave Desert, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain of Fort Irwin. Dust clouds rose in the distance as a column of M1A2 Abrams tanks thundered across the valley floor. The mechanical beasts moved with purpose, their turbine engines howling like hungry predators. Atop a rocky outcrop stood retired Colonel William Steele Bill Harrison. At 62, his face was weathered like the desert landscape, deep lines etched by decades of sun, wind, and warfare. His fingers, calloused and strong, rested on an old tanker's helmet, worn and faded from years of service. The name Harrison, barely visible on its side, partially obscured by a scratch from shrapnel that had nearly taken his life during Desert Storm. Harrison watched the tanks with the experienced eye of a man who had spent most of his life inside their armored shells. He could tell from the way they moved which commanders were hesitant, which were overconfident, and which had the natural instinct that separated the living from the dead in actual combat. "They're getting faster with the equipment," he muttered to himself, "but they're missing the soul of the beast." A desert hawk circled overhead, scanning for prey, much as Harrison had once scanned the burning oil fields of Kuwait for Iraqi tanks. The memory surged forward with such clarity that for a moment, the present faded away. February 1991, Operation Desert Storm. The largest tank battle since World War II was unfolding across the desert. Captain William Harrison, commander of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 66th Armor Regiment, stood in the commander's hatch of his M1A1 Abrams, call sign Iron Thunder. Sand pelted his goggles as he scanned the horizon through his binoculars. Black smoke billowed from hundreds of burning vehicles along what would later be called the Highway of Death. "Contact, 2 o'clock, his gunner, Sergeant Miller, called out. "T-72, approximately 2,200 meters. Harrison dropped down into the turret. The interior of the tank was surprisingly quiet compared to the chaos outside, though the smell of cordite, sweat, and diesel was overwhelming. "Identified," Harrison confirmed, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Sabot round, fire when ready." "On the way," Miller announced as he depressed the firing trigger. The tank rocked backward with the recoil of the 120mm main gun. A fraction of a second later, the depleted uranium rounds struck the T-72, punching through its frontal armor like paper. The Iraqi tank erupted in flames, its turret blown completely off by the ammunition cooking off inside. "Target destroyed. Scan for next target." By the end of that day, Harrison's company had destroyed 12 Iraqi tanks without losing a single Abrams. His actions during that battle earned him the Silver Star and cemented his reputation as one of the finest tank commanders in the U.S. Army. The roar of a modern Abrams engine pulled Harrison back to the present. The desert wind carried the scent of hot metal and diesel fuel, so familiar it was almost comforting. A younger man might have missed the slight change in engine pitch, but Harrison's ears were tuned to the sounds of these machines like a musician to an instrument. "Number 3's running hot," he said to no one in particular, nodding toward the third tank in the formation. "Rookie mistake, pushing too hard in this heat. Still diagnosing problems from a mile away, I see." Harrison turned to find Brigadier General James Westfield approaching from behind, dressed in desert camouflage with stars gleaming on his collar. They had served together in Iraq, though Westfield had always been destined for a higher rank with his West Point education and political connections. "Old habits," Harrison said with a slight smile. "What brings the base commander all the way out to this dusty overlook?" Westfield stood beside him, watching the tanks continue their maneuvers. "You, actually. The Pentagon has something in mind, something important." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "I've been retired for almost a year, Jim. Only on paper." Westfield handed him a folder stamped with "Top Secret" in bold red letters. "They need your expertise one last time. The future of American armored warfare might depend on it." Harrison took the folder but didn't open it. "I'm a relic, Jim, a museum piece. The Army's moving toward automated systems, drone tanks, AI-driven combat. What could they possibly want with an old tank commander?" "That's exactly why they need you," Westfield replied, his expression serious. "Read the file, then come see me in my office tomorrow morning." He clapped Harrison on the shoulder before turning to leave. "Some things machines can never learn, Bill. That's why they need you." As Westfield's vehicle disappeared in a cloud of dust, Harrison finally opened the folder. The first page contained a single photograph of an unmanned tank prototype designated ACS-01, alongside technical specifications that made his blood run cold. The future had arrived, and it was here to replace everything he had devoted his life to protecting. Chapter 2. The Steel Knights. The officers' club at Fort Irwin hadn't changed much in the 40 years Harrison had known it. The same faded battle flags hung from the rafters, the same scarred wooden bars stood against the far wall, and the same spirit of camaraderie filled the air. Only the faces changed over time, growing younger while Harrison grew older. Tonight, however, 3 familiar faces sat at a corner table waiting for him. Harrison nodded to the bartender, who slid him a glass of bourbon without being asked. Some rituals never needed explanation. "Gentlemen," Harrison said as he approached the table, "I see they've rounded up all the dinosaurs for this little experiment." Lieutenant Colonel Jack Thunder Ramsey rose from his chair, standing at an impressive 6'3". At 55, his hair had gone completely gray, but his physique remained that of a man 20 years younger. The jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline was a souvenir from an IED in Fallujah. He and Harrison had served together in Desert Storm when Ramsey was just a young lieutenant. "About damn time you showed up, Bill," Ramsey said, his voice a gravelly rumble as they clasped hands. "Was beginning to think you'd gone soft in retirement." "Retirement's been postponed," Harrison replied, taking a seat. "Apparently the Army can't solve its problems without us old warhorses." "That's because the problems need solving with something other than algorithms and circuit boards," said Captain Michael Eagle Eye Sullivan, raising his glass in greeting. At 42, Sullivan was the youngest of the group, though the perpetual squint from years of peering through gun sights made him appear older. Before transferring to armor, he had been a Navy SEAL sniper with a confirmed kill record that remained classified. His transition to becoming a tank gunner had raised eyebrows, but his extraordinary accuracy had silenced all critics. Sullivan could hit a moving target at 3 kilometers in desert conditions, a skill that had saved countless lives in Afghanistan. "You've all read the brief, I take it?" Harrison asked, looking around the table. The third man, Master Sergeant Derek Iron Man Thompson, nodded solemnly. At 48, Thompson's dark skin was weathered by years in the desert sun, and his massive hands bore the calluses and oil-stained cuticles of a man who had spent a lifetime fixing machines that didn't want to be fixed. He had earned his nickname after keeping an Abrams running during a 3-day siege in Sadr City, working on the engine while under constant enemy fire. "Autonomous combat system," Thompson said, his deep voice laced with contempt. "Fancy name for a robot that wants my job." "Not just your job," Ramsey pointed out. "All our jobs. The entire human element of tank warfare." Harrison took a long sip of his bourbon, feeling the familiar burn in his throat. "The Pentagon wants to phase out human tank crews entirely within 5 years. The ACS program is the first step." "And we're supposed to help them put us out to pasture?" Sullivan asked incredulously. "Quite the opposite," Harrison replied, leaning forward. "We're being called in to prove why they can't." He placed the folder on the table and spread out several photographs and technical documents. The ACS prototype resembled a conventional Abrams, but with a lower profile turret and no hatches for crew. According to the specifications, each unit could operate completely autonomously using advanced AI or be remotely controlled from a command center miles away from the battlefield. "The prototype has been in development for 3 years under Project Delta Force," Harrison explained. "Initial tests show it can acquire and engage targets faster than human crews, operate in environments lethal to humans, and coordinate tactics across an entire battalion with perfect synchronization." "Impressive on paper," Thompson remarked, studying the engine's specifications with professional interest. "But paper doesn't bleed and machines don't improvise." "Exactly," Harrison agreed, "which is why General Westfield and some allies at the Pentagon have arranged a special demonstration, the Steel Knights versus the machines." Ramsey whistled low. "They're really calling us that? The Steel Knights?" "PR department's idea," Harrison said with a faint smile. "Apparently they need a good story regardless of the outcome." Sullivan refilled his glass. "And what exactly are we supposed to do?" Harrison tapped a satellite image of Fort Irwin's sprawling desert training grounds. "We're being given 24 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 96 of the best veteran tank personnel still on active duty. We'll face 72 ACS units in a full-scale combat exercise." 3-to-1 odds, Thompson observed, just like the old days. "The exercise will run for 5 days across the entire National Training Center," Harrison continued. "Victory conditions are simple: destroy the opposing force or capture their command center." Ramsey leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his broad chest. "And what happens if we lose?" A heavy silence fell over the table. They all knew the stakes extended far beyond this single exercise. If we lose, Harrison said finally, the Department of Defense will have the data they need to justify phasing out manned tanks entirely. Our legacy, everything we've fought for, everything we've taught the next generation about armored warfare, will be obsolete. And if we win, Sullivan asked? Harrison's expression hardened. Then we buy time. Time for the human element to prove its worth. Time for them to reconsider replacing blood and instinct with silicon and algorithms. Thompson drained his glass and set it down firmly. When do we start? Training begins tomorrow at 0600, Harrison replied. We have 2 weeks to prepare for the exercise. 2 weeks to save 40 years of experience from being wiped out by progress. To the Steel Knights, Ramsey said, raising his glass in a toast. May we teach these machines what they can never learn on their own. To the Steel Knights, the others echoed, glasses clinking in the dim light of the officers' club. Later that night, alone in his Spartan quarters, Harrison stood before a small wooden case mounted on the wall. Inside, behind glass, lay his combat decorations, the Silver Star, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts from 3 wars across 4 decades. Beside them was a faded photograph of his original tank crew from Desert Storm. Only he and Ramsey were still alive. One last mission, boys, he whispered to the ghosts of comrades long gone. One last chance to make it count. Chapter 3 of the New World Order. The Pentagon briefing room hummed with activity as senior military officials, defense contractors, and members of the Congressional Armed Services Committee filed in. The room was designed to impress, with its polished oak table, plush chairs, and wall of monitors displaying classified military operations from around the globe. At the head of the table sat Defense Secretary Richard Thornton, a former corporate CEO with no military experience but extensive connections in the defense industry. Beside him stood Dr. Alexis Reynolds, the 45-year-old genius behind the autonomous combat system. Reynolds cut an imposing figure despite her medium height. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing green eyes seemed to evaluate everything and everyone in terms of data points. Before becoming the lead scientist on the ACS project, she had served as a captain in Army intelligence, where she had pioneered drone reconnaissance systems during the early days of the War on Terror. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Thornton began, we're here today to witness the future of American military dominance. Dr. Reynolds, the floor is yours. Reynolds stepped forward, activating the main display with a gesture. The screen illuminated with footage of the ACS prototype during field tests, effortlessly navigating obstacle courses and precisely targeting practice dummies at extreme ranges. The autonomous combat system represents the most significant advancement in ground warfare since the introduction of the tank itself, she declared, her voice crisp and confident. ACS units can operate continuously without rest, function in environments contaminated by chemical, biological, or radiological agents, and process tactical information at speeds no human crew could match. She brought up a simulation showing a battalion of ACS tanks outmaneuvering and overwhelming a conventionally crewed force twice its size. But most importantly, she continued, ACS saves American lives. No more flag-draped coffins returning from foreign battlefields. No more families torn apart by the loss of a father, mother, son, or daughter. The blood price of warfare will be paid in circuit boards and hydraulic fluid, not human lives. Several committee members nodded appreciatively. It was a compelling vision, especially for politicians who had to answer to constituents when body counts rose. What about the human element, Dr. Reynolds? The question came from General Maxwell Carter, Army Chief of Staff, and one of the few skeptics in the room. Warfare isn't just about processing speeds and target acquisition. It's about judgment, intuition, moral choices. Reynolds smiled thinly. With respect, General, that romantic notion of warfare belongs to the last century. Modern combat is about information processing and reaction time. Our testing shows that ACS makes better tactical decisions because it isn't clouded by fear, fatigue, or emotional attachment. And who determines what better means in this context, Carter pressed. The data does, General, Reynolds replied coolly. The ACS learns from every engagement, actual and simulated. It has already absorbed the tactical lessons of every major tank battle in history, from Kursk to Fallujah. Secretary Thornton cleared his throat. We've arranged a final validation exercise to address these concerns, General. A force of veteran tank commanders led by Colonel William Harrison will face off against ACS units at Fort Irwin. The results should settle this debate conclusively. At the mention of Harrison's name, Reynolds' expression tightened almost imperceptibly. With all due respect, Secretary Thornton, pitting obsolete tactics against next-generation technology isn't a fair test. It's sentimentality, not strategy. On the contrary, Dr. Reynolds, Carter countered, if your system is truly superior, it should have no trouble defeating even our most experienced commanders, regardless of their tactics. Reynolds conceded with a slight nod. Very well, but let me be clear about what's at stake. The future of American military dominance depends on embracing autonomous systems. Our adversaries are already developing their own versions. The nation that hesitates will be left behind. She turned to address the entire room, her voice resonating with conviction. The era of human tank commanders is ending. The time of machines has begun. We can either lead this revolution or become its victims. As the meeting concluded, Reynolds remained behind, reviewing data on her tablet. General Carter approached her quietly. "You served with distinction, Captain Reynolds," he said, deliberately using her former rank. "You know better than most that war is ultimately a human endeavor." Reynolds looked up, her expression guarded. "My experience in Iraq taught me that human error gets people killed, General. My convoy was ambushed because a tired lieutenant misread intelligence reports. 3 good soldiers died that day. An autonomous system wouldn't have made that mistake. And would it have stopped to save the civilian children caught in the crossfire? As you did?" Carter asked softly. "Would it have risked mission parameters to preserve innocent life?" Reynolds fell silent, the memory clearly still painful after all these years. "I respect what you're trying to build, Doctor," Carter continued. "But don't be so quick to dismiss what you're trying to replace. There's wisdom in those old tankers that no algorithm can duplicate." After Carter departed, Reynolds stood alone in the conference room, staring at the frozen image of an ACS tank on the main display. Her hand unconsciously moved to trace the outline of a scar hidden beneath her collar, a permanent reminder of the day she'd lost faith in human judgment. "We'll see whose wisdom prevails," she whispered to the empty room. Chapter 4. The Final Challenge. Dawn broke over Fort Irwin as Harrison stood before his assembled force. 24 tanks and 96 men, a mixture of veterans pulled from retirement and active duty personnel with combat experience. They formed a semicircle around him, their faces solemn in the early morning light. Behind Harrison, 4 M1A1 Abrams tanks were positioned in perfect alignment, their desert tan paint scheme still bearing the scars and scratches of actual combat. These weren't the latest models with all the upgrades and improvements. These were tanks that had seen war, just like the men who would crew them. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying across the assembly area without need of amplification, "I won't insult your intelligence with patriotic speeches or nostalgic bullshit. You all know why we're here." He gestured toward a distant section of the base where the ACS units were being prepared. Even from this distance, the low-profile turrets of the autonomous tanks were visible, their sleek design distinctly different from the traditional Abrams. "In 5 days, we face an enemy that doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, doesn't fear, and doesn't bleed. The autonomous combat system represents the cutting edge of modern warfare technology. Its supporters believe it will make us obsolete." A murmur ran through the assembled men, a mixture of indignation and concern. "They're wrong," Harrison continued, his conviction evident in every word. "Machines can calculate, they can execute, they can even learn after a fashion, but they cannot truly understand the chaos of battle. They cannot feel the rhythm of combat that guides an experienced commander's decisions. They cannot improvise with the creative desperation that has won countless engagements throughout history." He paced along the line of men, making eye contact with as many as possible. Some he recognized from past deployments. Others were new faces, but with the same resolute expression he had seen countless times in briefings before actual combat. This exercise isn't just about proving our worth to the Pentagon. It's about defending the soul of armored warfare. It's about ensuring that when American tanks roll into battle, they carry with them not just firepower, but humanity, judgment, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of warriors who came before us. Harrison stopped beside the lead tank, placing his hand on its armor, as if greeting an old friend. "Each of you has been selected because you've demonstrated something machines can never possess. Instinct. The ability to sense when the battlefield is about to change. The courage to take calculated risks. The judgment to know when the book answer is wrong." Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey stepped forward. "We're outnumbered 3-1. They have newer equipment, faster processors, in perfect communication. How do we overcome those advantages? Harrison smiled, a predatory expression that had preceded the destruction of many enemy tanks. The same way tankers have always prevailed against superior numbers and technology, we use the terrain to our advantage. We strike where they don't expect. We fight as individuals within a coordinated whole, not as parts of a hive mind. We make them react to us, not the other way around. He turned to face the entire group once more. Make no mistake, this will be the hardest mission many of you have faced. These machines learn from every engagement. They don't make the same mistake twice. They communicate instantly across the entire battle space. But they have one critical weakness. Harrison's voice dropped, forcing everyone to lean in slightly to hear him. They think like machines. They operate on probability and logic. They cannot conceive of the gloriously irrational human decision that changes the entire paradigm of battle. And that, gentlemen, is how we will win. Master Sergeant Thompson raised his hand. Sir, what about the rules of engagement? Are there restrictions on tactics we can employ? Excellent question, Sergeant, Harrison replied. The exercise will simulate actual combat conditions as closely as possible. We're authorized to use any conventional tactic that would be legal in wartime. The training area encompasses the entire National Training Center, over 1,000 square miles of terrain. Victory conditions are straightforward. Destroy or disable all enemy units or capture their command center. Captain Sullivan spoke up next. And what are we actually facing in terms of their capabilities? Harrison nodded to a junior officer who distributed technical briefing packets to each tank commander. The ACS units use a modified Abrams chassis with an unmanned turret. Their main gun has the same ballistics as ours, but with an advanced fire control system that eliminates human factors like fatigue or stress. They're networked together with encrypted communications that allow them to coordinate as a single entity. Their sensors include thermal, radar, and optical systems that exceed human vision in range and clarity. The men studied the specifications with professional interest, some frowning, others nodding thoughtfully as they assessed their opponent. One final note, Harrison added. This exercise will be observed by everyone who matters in determining the future of American armored forces. The Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, congressional committees, and defense contractors. The stakes couldn't be higher. He looked at the faces before him, seeing not just individual men, but the living embodiment of a tradition stretching back to the first tanks that crawled across the battlefields of World War I. For a century, tanks have been the decisive arm of ground warfare. And for a century, it has been men like you who have made those tanks instruments of victory. Our challenge now is to prove that the human element remains essential, that the soul of the machine matters as much as its capabilities. Harrison straightened to his full height, his voice ringing with authority. We are the Steel Knights. We stand as guardians of a legacy written in courage, sacrifice, and victory. In 5 days, we will show the world why men, not machines, are the true masters of the battlefield. Dismissed. As the assembly dispersed, Harrison remained standing beside the lead tank, his expression thoughtful. Ramsey approached, concern evident in his weathered features. They're not just testing the machines against us, are they, Bill? He asked quietly. They're testing us against history. Harrison nodded slowly. The world is changing, Jack. Technology, politics, warfare itself. This may be our last chance to prove that some things shouldn't change, that some knowledge can't be programmed, only experienced. You really think we can win against those odds? Harrison gazed toward the distant horizon where dust devils danced across the desert landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. We have to, not just for ourselves, but for every tanker who will come after us. If we fail here, we're not just losing tanks. We're losing the human connection to warfare itself. And that, old friend, is a far more dangerous proposition than any weapon system could ever be. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, casting harsh light and sharp shadows across the assembly area. In the distance, a formation of ACS tanks began their own preparation sequence, metal gleaming in the morning sun. Their movements precise and identical, like a dance choreographed by an invisible hand. The final challenge was set. Man versus machine, experience versus technology, soul versus silicon. In 5 days, the future would be decided in fire and dust on the ancient proving grounds of Fort Irwin. Dawn broke over the Mojave in shades of crimson and gold. Colonel William Harrison stood atop the command vehicle, his weathered face illuminated by the first rays of sunlight as he surveyed the terrain that would soon become their battlefield. 24 Abrams tanks rumbled behind him, their crews performing final checks with the practiced efficiency of veterans. "Beautiful morning for a war," Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey remarked, climbing up beside Harrison. "Every morning is," Harrison replied without lowering his binoculars. "Though I'd prefer real clouds. This heat's going to push our cooling systems to the limit." The temperature was already climbing past 80 degrees, with projections exceeding 100 by midday. Desert warfare was as much a battle against the environment as against the enemy. "ACS units don't sweat," Ramsey observed dryly. Harrison finally lowered the binoculars, turning to his old friend. "They also don't get gut feelings about ambush points or notice the subtle details that save lives. Remember Nasiriyah?" Ramsey nodded, his expression darkening. During the invasion of Iraq, Harrison had halted their advance based on nothing more than the unusual absence of civilians in a small town. His instinct had proven correct when they discovered a massive ambush prepared in the narrow streets ahead. "First element moves out in 15 minutes, Harrison said, checking his watch. "Time to make history or become it." The battle plan was straightforward. The Steel Knights would advance in 4 platoons toward tactical positions in the Western Hills. Intelligence suggested the ACS units would attempt to engage them in the open desert, where their superior targeting systems would have the advantage. As Harrison's command tank led the first platoon through a narrow valley flanked by steep rock walls, the desert heat created a shimmering mirage effect that distorted the horizon. "Command to all units," Harrison spoke into his radio. "Maintain dispersal pattern Alpha. Watch your intervals. These valleys are perfect kill zones." "Contact front!" The voice of his gunner, Specialist Rodriguez, cracked through the intercom. "Multiple targets bearing 035, range 2,000 meters." Harrison swiveled his periscope to the northeast. On a distant ridgeline, the unmistakable silhouettes of tanks appeared, their low profiles distinctive of the ACS units. "Identify," Harrison ordered calmly. "Confirmed ACS units," Rodriguez replied. "I count 12 vehicles in staggered formation." Harrison keyed his radio. "All units, enemy contact at northeast ridgeline. Maintain advance. Prepare for contact." The doctrine called for immediately seeking cover or returning fire. But Harrison recognized the trap. The ACS units were positioned just at the edge of effective range, inviting the human commanders to waste ammunition on low-probability shots or divert from their planned route. "Sir?" Rodriguez questioned, clearly anxious to engage. "Hold fire," Harrison commanded. "They want us to react, to break formation and chase them across open ground." For 2 hours, this strange dance continued, with the human tanks advancing methodically while the ACS units shadowed them from the ridgelines, occasionally firing ranging shots that fell deliberately short. It was psychological warfare against an enemy supposedly immune to such tactics. As the Steel Knights approached the first objective, a plateau offering commanding views of the surrounding desert, the nature of the engagement suddenly changed. "Multiple contacts." The warning came simultaneously from several platoons. "Enemy armor approaching from all vectors." Harrison raised his periscope to see ACS units streaming down from the ridges, converging on their position with precision and speed that seemed almost supernatural. The machines had been waiting for this exact moment, when the human force would be caught in the open. "All units, defensive formation Bravo," Harrison ordered, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "Hold your ground." The desert erupted with the thunder of 120mm guns as the Steel Knights engaged the approaching ACS units. The simulation system registered hits and misses, calculating damage and disabling tanks accordingly. Within minutes, 3 of Harrison's tanks were destroyed. The ACS units moved with uncanny coordination, focusing fire on individual targets to maximize effectiveness. They showed no hesitation, no confusion, no mercy. Each movement seemed calculated to expose the weaknesses in the human formation. "They're inside our decision loop," Ramsey's voice crackled over the command channel. "They're reacting faster than we can coordinate." Harrison watched as another of his tanks went dark, systems disabled by multiple simulated hits. The ACS advantage in processing speed and communication was proving devastating in open combat. Each human command had to be verbalized, transmitted, received, and acknowledged, a process that took precious seconds. The machines communicated instantly, adjusting their tactics in microseconds. "Fall back to secondary positions," Harrison ordered, recognizing the futility of their current stance. "Tactical withdrawal by platoons." The retreat was orderly but costly. By the time the remaining Steel Knights reached the cover of the Western Hills, 8 of their 24 tanks had been destroyed. The ACS units pursued relentlessly, probing every potential defensive position with calculated precision. As night fell over the desert, Harrison called his remaining commanders to a hastily established command post in a narrow canyon. The men gathered around a tactical display, their faces grim in the blue glow of the screen. "They kicked our asses," Sullivan stated bluntly, voicing what everyone knew. "They did," Harrison acknowledged without defensiveness. "Their coordination is unlike anything I've ever encountered. Every unit acts as part of a perfect whole." Harrison studied the tactical map, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. "They fight like machines, which is both their strength and their weakness. There's a pattern to their responses, a predictability in their perfection. Pattern or not, we lost 8 tanks today," Ramsey pointed out. "At this rate, we'll be wiped out by day 3. "Then we change the pattern," Harrison replied, his eyes reflecting the determination that had carried him through 3 wars. "Tomorrow we stop fighting like a conventional armored force. We start fighting like men with nothing to lose." Chapter 6. The Iron Man Stands Alone. Morning fog shrouded the desert in an ethereal blanket, transforming the harsh landscape into something otherworldly. Visibility was reduced to less than 200 meters, muting the colors and softening the harsh lines of rock and sand. Harrison saw opportunity in the weather conditions. "The fog negates their sensor advantage," he explained to his commanders during the pre-dawn briefing. "Today we fight in elements of 2 tanks, small, independent units making unpredictable movements." The revised strategy was risky, sacrificing the combined firepower of platoon formations for tactical flexibility. But after yesterday's losses, conventional approaches were a luxury they couldn't afford. "We're abandoning doctrine," Sullivan observed, not as criticism, but with a hint of admiration. "Doctrine is for peacetime," Harrison replied. "Survival is for war." As the Steel Knights deployed across a 10-kilometer front, the fog began to thin in patches, creating a patchwork of visibility that further complicated battlefield awareness for both sides. Throughout the morning, the dispersed Steel Knights managed several successful engagements against isolated ACS units, destroying 5 enemy tanks while losing only 1 of their own. Harrison was coordinating the repositioning of his forces when an urgent transmission cut through the routine radio traffic. "Command, this is Ramsey. ACS units have located our maintenance point. Thompson's isolated with a disabled tank." Harrison's blood ran cold. The maintenance point was in a small valley with limited approaches, ideal for repairs, but potentially a death trap if discovered by the enemy. "How many hostiles?" Harrison demanded, already signaling his driver to change course. "Satellite imagery shows at least 30 ACS units converging on his position," Ramsey reported, his voice tense. "They must have detected his heat signature when the engine malfunctioned." Harrison keyed his radio to the command channel. "All available units near Echo 7 converge and support Thompson. Everyone else maintain position and continue engagement." He switched to a direct channel to Thompson's tank. "Iron Man, you've got multiple hostiles inbound. What's your status?" Thompson's voice came back, remarkably calm given the circumstances. "Engine's still down. Jones is buried in the compartment trying to bypass a fried control module. Might need another 20 minutes. "You don't have 20 minutes, Harrison said grimly. "ACS units approaching from the north and east, at least 30 of them. Can you move at all?" "Negative, sir. We're dead in the water until Jones finishes." Harrison considered his options. The nearest support units were at least 15 minutes away. Thompson would be surrounded long before help could arrive. "Abandon the tank," Harrison ordered. "Get your crew to the rocky outcroppings to the south. We'll extract you by helicopter." A long pause followed, filled only with static. When Thompson's voice returned, it carried a resolve that Harrison recognized from countless desperate situations. "With respect, sir, no one's abandoning this tank. Jones says 10 more minutes. We've got full ammunition and a functioning weapon system. We'll hold them off." Harrison closed his eyes briefly, knowing he was listening to a death sentence delivered with the matter-of-fact courage that defined men like Thompson. "Understood, Iron Man. Help is on the way. Hold as long as you can." In the disabled Abrams, Master Sergeant Derek Thompson surveyed his situation with the calculating eye of a man who had faced impossible odds before. His tank was positioned with its rear against a large rock formation, providing some protection while presenting the heavily armored front to the approaching enemy. He had a clear field of fire across the valley floor where the ACS units would have to advance. "Target sighted," Simmons reported, his eye pressed to the gunner's sight. "ACS unit approaching from the north. range 1,500 meters. Thompson swiveled his commander's periscope to verify. The unmistakable profile of an ACS tank appeared on the horizon, moving with the deliberate precision of a machine unburdened by fear or hesitation. More contacts, Simmons added. 2, 5, 8. Jesus, they're all coming straight for us. Through his periscope, Thompson watched as the horizon filled with advancing ACS units. They moved in perfect formation, spreading out to envelop his position from multiple angles. The cold efficiency of their approach was more terrifying than any human aggression could have been. Target lead vehicle, Thompson ordered. Fire when ready. The tank rocked with they recoil as the main gun fired. Through his sight, Thompson watched the round impact the lead ACS unit directly in its frontal armor. In the simulation, the ACS unit systems registered the hit and immediately shut down, simulating destruction. But the others came on, unperturbed by the loss of their comrade. They adjusted their formation smoothly, maintaining their relentless advance. For the next hour, Thompson's tank fought a desperate holding action against overwhelming odds. Their position allowed them to engage the ACS units as they crested the surrounding ridgelines, destroying 7 more before they could establish firing positions. But with each passing minute, the machines adapted their approach, probing for weaknesses in Thompson's defense. Running low on sabot rounds, Simmons reported after destroying their 12th ACS unit, down to heat and canister. Thompson nodded grimly. The high-explosive anti-tank rounds were less effective against the frontal armor of the ACS units, while canister rounds, essentially turning the main gun into a giant shotgun, were only effective at very close range. "They're flanking us on the right," Simmons warned. 3 units approaching from the rocks. Thompson swiveled to see 3 ACS tanks emerging from a narrow defile that should have been inaccessible to vehicles their size. Somehow the machines had found a path through the rocky terrain that no human commander would have attempted. "Traverse right," Thompson ordered. "Target lead vehicle." Before they could fire, the ACS unit returned fire. Multiple impacts rocked Thompson's tank as the simulation registered critical hits on their turret mechanisms and main gun. "We've lost the main gun," Simmons reported, his voice tight with tension. "Turret hydraulics are gone too." Thompson assessed their situation with grim clarity. Without the main gun, they were effectively neutered as a fighting force. The coaxial machine gun remained operational, but it was useless against armored targets. As Jones engaged the engine, the tank lurched forward, the damaged track causing them to veer slightly with each surge of power. They had barely covered 50 meters when the ACS units opened fire again. The tank shuddered to a stop as the simulation enforced the effects of the damage they had sustained. "Sir," Simmons said quietly, "it's been an honor." Thompson placed a hand on his gunner's shoulder. "They haven't finished us yet." In that moment, Thompson spotted something the machines had missed. Their position, while exposed to direct fire, was on the edge of a shallow depression filled with loose sand and gravel. The ground directly in front of their tank sloped downward before rising again to the ridgeline where several ACS units were now positioning themselves. He switched to the command frequency. "Command, this is Iron Man. We're immobilized but still fighting. Request immediate artillery simulation on our position." Harrison's voice came back immediately, confusion evident in his tone. "Thompson, say again. You're requesting fire on your own position?" "Affirmative, sir. Trust me on this one." "Artillery simulation approved. Impact in 30 seconds. Good luck, Iron Man." The simulation system activated, replicating the effects of a massive artillery barrage directly on and around their position. In a real battle, such a strike would have churned the earth into a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. In the exercise, it registered as destroying 5 ACS units caught in the open and severely damaging several others. More importantly, it shook loose the sandy soil of the depression, creating a miniature landslide that flowed around their tank. "Now, Jones, full power!" The engine roared one last time, pushing the tank forward into the disturbed soil. As Thompson had anticipated, the loose sand and gravel provided just enough reduced friction for their damaged track to function. The tank surged forward, riding the wave of displaced earth down the shallow slope and directly toward the regrouping ACS units. The machines, programmed to expect a disabled enemy to remain stationary or retreat, were momentarily slow to react to the unexpected charge. Thompson's tank smashed into the lead ACS unit, the simulation registering the impact as destructive to both vehicles, but allowing Thompson's momentum to continue. For the next chaotic minutes, Thompson's crippled tank became the center of a swirling melee of armored vehicles. Unable to use their main gun, they resorted to ramming tactics and precision machine gun fire at the sensors and vision blocks of the ACS units. It was warfare reduced to its most primitive form, with Thompson's human crew improvising tactics no programmer had anticipated. By the time Harrison's relief force arrived, Thompson's tank was completely immobilized, its systems registering damage that would have left it a burning hulk in real combat. But surrounding it lay the simulated wrecks of 22 ACS units, destroyed by a combination of main gunfire, artillery, ramming attacks, and the desperate ingenuity of men fighting against machines. As Harrison's tank pulled alongside the disabled veteran, Thompson emerged from his commander's hatch, his face streaked with sweat and grease from the engine repairs. He straightened and rendered a perfect salute, the discipline of decades overriding his exhaustion. "Master Sergeant Thompson and crew reporting mission accomplished, sir." Harrison returned the salute with equal formality, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile of genuine admiration. "Iron Man indeed," he said simply. "The history books just got a new chapter." Chapter 7. Ghosts in the Machine. The third day of the exercise dawned with a changed atmosphere in the Steel Knights forward base. The legend of Thompson's stand had transformed the mood from grim determination to something approaching confidence. If one tank and crew could destroy 22 ACS units through sheer audacity and improvisation, perhaps the machines weren't as invincible as they had seemed. "Yesterday proved what we've always known," Harrison began the morning briefing. "The human element can never be fully calculated or predicted." Master Sergeant Thompson turned certain defeat into victory by doing exactly what the machines considered impossible. Thompson, now something of a celebrity among the ranks, nodded modestly from his position at the edge of the group. His tank had been deemed irreparable within the constraints of the exercise, so he was now serving as a tactical advisor to Harrison's command staff. "But we can't count on individual heroics to win this engagement," Harrison continued. "The ACS units are learning, adapting to our tactics faster than conventional enemies could. Their coordination remains their greatest strength." He gestured to a series of marked positions across the map. "Today we implement Operation Ghost Protocol. Each tank will operate independently, using terrain features to mask movements and thermal signatures. We'll strike from unexpected angles, then disappear before they can coordinate a response." Sullivan studied the proposed movement paths with a professional eye. This completely abandons conventional armored doctrine. No mutual support, no concentration of firepower. "Exactly," Harrison confirmed. "Doctrine is what they've studied, what they expect. We need to be unpredictable, irrational by their standards." The plan was audacious, dispersing their 16 remaining tanks across 50 square kilometers of desert terrain. Each commander would have complete autonomy to select targets and engage at their discretion, with only general objectives assigned by Harrison's command staff. "One final note," Harrison added as the briefing concluded. "Intelligence suggests the ACS command center is located in Sector Golf 9. Any unit that can penetrate their security perimeter and confirm this location will provide us a decisive advantage for the final phase." Throughout the morning, the Ghost Protocol proved surprisingly effective. The dispersed Steel Knights used the complex terrain of Fort Irwin to full advantage, appearing from hidden wadis to strike isolated ACS units before melting back into the landscape. By midday, they had destroyed 11 enemy tanks while losing only 2 of their own. Inside his command tank, Harrison monitored the shifting battle through fragmented radio reports and satellite imagery. The dispersed nature of their operations made maintaining a coherent picture of the engagement challenging, but it also prevented the ACS network from predicting their overall strategy. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "Captain Sullivan has penetrated to the edge of Sector Golf 9. He reports increased ACS activity consistent with a command center location." Before the order to maintain observation could be transmitted, Sullivan's voice cracked over the command channel, tense with urgency. "Command, this is Eagle Eye. I've located what appears to be the ACS command center. Multiple specialized vehicles in a central command unit, but they've spotted me, taking heavy fire." The transmission cut off abruptly. On the tactical display, Sullivan's tank icon flashed red, then went dark, indicating a catastrophic kill in the simulation. Harrison made his decision instantly. "Ramsey, take your element and create a diversion on the western edge of Golf 9. I'm going in after Sullivan." "Alone?" Ramsey questioned, concern evident in his voice. Harrison was already moving toward his tank. Sometimes the best way to find a ghost is to become one. As Harrison's tank moved through the broken terrain towards Sullivan's last position, the desert seemed unnaturally still. No dust clouds marked the movement of enemy units. No engine sounds carried on the dry air. Sullivan's tank, Harrison confirmed as they spotted the destroyed Abrams. But where are the ACS units that took him out? The answer came with terrifying suddenness, as the valley erupted with coordinated fire from concealed positions. Impacts rocked Harrison's tank as the simulation registered multiple hits on their armor and suspension system. "Ambush!" his driver shouted, already reversing at maximum speed. "They're in the rocks on both sides." They used Sullivan as bait, Harrison realized aloud. They're learning our emotional responses. The retreat quickly became a desperate running battle as Harrison's tank weaved through the terrain, using every feature for momentary cover. The ACS units pursued relentlessly, their coordinated fire gradually wearing down the Abrams simulated systems. As they approached a dry riverbed, Harrison noticed something odd about the pursuing ACS units. They had split into smaller elements, some continuing the direct pursuit while others moved to parallel courses. "They're hurting us," he realized suddenly. "Driver, change course immediately. Head directly for that rock formation to the north." The tank lurched as it changed direction, now driving directly toward an ACS unit that had been attempting to flank them. The unexpected maneuver caught the machine off guard, and Harrison's gunner managed to get a shot off before the ACS could respond effectively. But the small victory was short-lived. The remaining ACS units quickly adjusted their tactics, concentrating fire on Harrison's tank from multiple angles. System failures cascaded as the simulation registered hit after hit on critical components. They had barely reached the modest protection of a large boulder when the engine simulation finally registered complete failure. Harrison's tank, like Sullivan's before it, was now immobile and vulnerable, a stationary target for the converging ACS units. As he watched the ACS units establish a perimeter around their disabled tank, Harrison noticed something strange. They were moving in a peculiar pattern, maintaining their containment cordon, but shifting positions in what seemed like an unnecessarily complex rotation. "They're scanning for something," Harrison murmured, studying the movement pattern. "They're using us as a fixed reference point to create a precise terrain map. This is reconnaissance for a larger operation." He keyed his radio to the General Command channel. "All units, this is Harrison. The ACS Command Center is not in Sector Golf 9. I repeat, not in Golf 9. It's a deception operation." Before he could continue, the radio erupted with urgent reports from multiple sectors. ACS units were suddenly on the move across the entire battlefield, abandoning containment operations and converging toward the northeastern quadrant of the training area. "They're consolidating," Harrison realized. This was all a diversion. As if to confirm his analysis, the ACS units surrounding his disabled tank began to withdraw, maintaining a minimal containment force while redirecting the majority of their strength elsewhere. Harrison keyed his radio again. "All mobile units, converge on Sector King 3. That's the location of their command center. They're consolidating to protect it." Ramsey's voice came back immediately. "How can you be sure?" "Because they just showed their hand," Harrison replied. "When machines think they've won, they optimize for efficiency. They're pulling back to defend what matters." In the control center, Dr. Reynolds watched the sudden shift in ACS deployment with growing alarm. The autonomous units were indeed consolidating around the command center in Sector King 3, abandoning their advantageous tactical positions to reinforce the central control node. "They're showing primitive protection instincts," one of her technicians observed. "Self-preservation is overriding tactical optimization." Reynolds frowned, studying the real-time deployment map. "No, not self-preservation. They're following their primary directive to protect the command infrastructure at all costs. But that's creating a vulnerability across the rest of the battle space," another analyst pointed out. "They're giving up positional advantage." Reynolds nodded slowly, a realization dawning that she had never anticipated. "They're thinking like machines, not like commanders. Logical but predictable." On her screen, she watched as the scattered human tanks began to converge on the northeastern sector, exploiting gaps in the ACS defensive network that shouldn't have existed. Harrison had somehow identified the core behavior pattern in the autonomous system and was exploiting it ruthlessly. "Interesting," she murmured, genuine respect coloring her tone for the first time. "The old wolf still has teeth." As night fell across the desert battlefield, the Steel Knights regrouped at a forward position overlooking Sector King 3. Despite the losses of the day, including Sullivan's tank and the effective neutralization of Harrison's command vehicle, morale remained surprisingly high. They had identified the location of the ACS command center and forced the machines to reveal a fundamental weakness in their operational programming. Today we learned something vital about our adversary, Harrison told his remaining commanders. The ACS units are formidable, coordinated, and adaptive, but they remain machines bound by their programming and primary directives. He gestured toward the distant lights visible in Sector King 3, where the ACS command center had established its defensive perimeter. Tomorrow we exploit that knowledge. Tomorrow we stop reacting to their moves and force them to react to ours. Tomorrow we prove once and for all that machines may calculate, but only humans can truly command. Chapter 8, The Turning Point. Pre-dawn stillness enveloped the desert as Harrison finalized the plan for the fourth day of the exercise. The Steel Knights had suffered significant losses, with only 13 operational tanks remaining against 47 ACS units. But the identification of the enemy command center had provided them with a clear objective and, more importantly, insight into the machine's operational priorities. "They've established a classic defense in depth," Thompson observed, pointing to the northeastern quadrant where the ACS units had consolidated. 3 concentric rings around the command center, with interlocking fields of fire. A frontal assault would be suicide. Harrison nodded, "Which is why we won't attack from the front, or from any single direction." The plan Harrison outlined was audacious to the point of recklessness. The remaining Steel Knights would split into 4 elements of 3 tanks each, with Harrison commanding the final tank as a mobile reserve. Each element would approach the ACS defensive perimeter from a different direction, creating the impression of a coordinated attack from all sides. "But we're not actually trying to break through," Harrison explained. "We're creating a diversion for our real objective." He highlighted a narrow ravine on the southern approach to the ACS position. Satellite imagery shows a maintenance access route here, likely for resupply and technical support of the command center. It's minimally defended because the terrain is considered too restrictive for effective tank operations. "A Trojan horse approach," Thompson said with grudging admiration. "Bold, but extremely high risk." As the sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the desert in golden light, the 4 diversionary elements began their coordinated approach toward the ACS defensive perimeter. From his position in a sheltered wadi 2 kilometers south of the objective, Harrison monitored their progress via radio. "It's time," he told his crew. "Driver, advance through the ravine. Maintain minimum speed consistent with quiet operation." Desert Phantom moved forward, emerging from the wadi and approaching the narrow ravine that wound between towering sandstone formations. The passage was barely 3 meters wider than the tank itself, leaving almost no margin for error in navigation. 1 kilometer to target, Harrison noted. Noted, checking the GPS coordinates. "So far, so good. No indication they've detected our approach." The diversionary elements continued to engage the ACS defensive perimeter, drawing enemy fire and attention. Radio reports indicated that 2 more Steel Knights had been destroyed in the simulation, but the remaining tanks were successfully fixing the ACS units in position. "Thermal signatures ahead," Martinez reported from the gunner's position. 2 sources, approximately 300 meters, near the ravine exit. Harrison raised his periscope to study the area ahead. The ravine widened into a small clearing before the final approach to the ACS command center. 2 vehicles were visible, not main battle tanks, but smaller support units, likely maintenance or resupply vehicles. "We need to neutralize them quickly and quietly," he decided. "Gunner, target the leftmost vehicle. Loader, prepare heat round." "Heat loaded," Williams confirmed as he slammed the massive shell into the breech. "Fire!" The 120mm main gun roared in the confined space of the ravine, the sound reverberating between the stone walls like thunder. The heat round streaked toward the support vehicle, the simulation registering a direct hit and catastrophic damage. "Target destroyed," Martinez reported, already traversing to the second vehicle. "Load Sabot," Harrison ordered. The second support vehicle was neutralized before it could transmit an alarm. Desert Phantom surged forward, emerging from the ravine into the small clearing beyond. The ACS command center was now visible, a collection of specialized vehicles arranged in a defensive circle approximately 400 meters ahead. "Target that command vehicle," Harrison directed. "Driver, maintain course directly toward objective." The ACS defensive network, preoccupied with the diversionary attacks on its perimeter, was slow to detect the threat approaching from its supposedly secure southern access route. By the time sensors registered Desert Phantom's advance, Harrison's tank had closed to within 200 meters of the command center. "They've spotted us," Martinez reported as defensive weapons began to track their approach. ACS units disengaging from the perimeter, moving to intercept. "Maintain course. Gunner, fire when ready." The main gun fired, the round streaking toward the heart of the ACS command network. On the tactical display, the simulation registered a direct hit on the command vehicle, immediately affecting the coordinated response of the entire ACS force. For the next intense minutes, Desert Phantom engaged in close-quarters battle with the ACS Command Center's protective detail. Without their central coordination, the autonomous vehicles reverted to more basic defensive protocols, lacking the seamless integration that had made them so formidable earlier in the exercise. "ACS reinforcements approaching from the north," the driver warned. 30 seconds until they're in firing position. Harrison checked their ammunition status. "One last target. Gunner, the backup command vehicle at our 2 o'clock. The round struck with precision, the simulation registering critical damage to the backup command systems. Immediately, the tactical display showed disruption rippling through the entire ACS network, as autonomous units temporarily lost coordination while control protocols attempted to redistribute. "Mission accomplished," Harrison announced. "Driver, get us out of here. Head for the eastern exit." Throughout the battlefield, the remaining Steel Knights reported a noticeable change in enemy behavior. The ACS units continued to fight, but their tactics became more predictable, their responses more standardized and less adaptive. "They've fallen back on basic programming," Ramsey reported over the command channel. "We're engaging effectively now that their coordination advantage is neutralized." By mid-afternoon, the momentum of the exercise had shifted dramatically. The Steel Knights, though reduced to just 11 operational tanks, had destroyed or disabled 27 ACS units since the successful strike on the command center. In the exercise control center, Dr. Reynolds watched the unfolding scenario with a mixture of professional disappointment and reluctant admiration. Her carefully designed autonomous network, which had performed flawlessly in hundreds of simulations, was being systematically dismantled by tactics no algorithm had anticipated. "They identified our command and control architecture," she acknowledged to the monitoring team, "and exploited its centralized nature." "Should we implement the distributed command protocol?" one of her engineers suggested. "We could restore full operational capability." Reynolds considered the option, then slowly shook her head. "No, let the exercise play out as is. This is educational." On her primary monitor, satellite imagery showed Desert Phantom regrouping with the remaining Steel Knights on a ridgeline overlooking the compromised ACS command center. The human tankers had achieved what her simulations had calculated as virtually impossible. "Remarkable," she murmured, studying the Harrison's tank as it maneuvered into defensive position. "They chose potential catastrophic failure over certain incremental defeat." As night fell over Fort Irwin, both sides prepared for the final day of the exercise. The Steel Knights repaired what damage they could, redistributed ammunition, and refined their tactical plans. The ACS units, operating on emergency protocols, established new defensive positions and communication networks. In his temporary command post, Harrison reviewed the status reports from his remaining tanks. The odds remained heavily against them, but something fundamental had changed in the nature of the engagement. The machines had lost more than their command center. They had lost the mystique of invincibility. "One more day," Harrison told himself as he studied the positions of friend and foe on the tactical display. "One last chance to prove what we're worth." The desert night wrapped around the scattered forces, cool and indifferent to the struggle between man and machine that would resume with the dawn. Stars appeared one by one in the vast, ancient light reaching down to illuminate a battlefield where humanity's relationship with its creations was being redefined with each passing hour. Stars punctured the vast canvas of the desert sky, their ancient light falling on the bivouac of the Steel Knights. The temperature had plummeted with the setting sun, as it always did in the Mojave, and a profound silence had settled over the landscape, broken only by the occasional clink of tools against metal as crews made final adjustments to their battle-worn tanks. Colonel William Harrison stood alone on a rocky promontory overlooking the scattered positions of his remaining force. 11 tanks, 11 against 47. The odds were still overwhelmingly against them, despite their success in neutralizing the ACS command center. But something had changed in the nature of the conflict. The machines had lost their aura of invincibility. They could be beaten. They had been beaten. "Beautiful night," Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey's voice came from behind him. "Makes you realize how small we are." Harrison nodded without turning around. "The stars don't care who wins tomorrow." Ramsey joined him at the edge of the outcropping, the silver flask in his hand catching the starlight as he offered it to Harrison. Desert night rations, for medicinal purposes only, of course. Harrison accepted the flask with a soft chuckle, taking a measured sip of the whiskey inside. The liquid burned a warm path down his throat, kindling a small fire in his chest. "I've been thinking about Willis," Ramsey said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them, "and Rodriguez, and all the others we lost over there." Harrison knew exactly which over there Ramsey meant. The sands of Iraq and Kuwait, where they had first commanded tanks in actual combat, where theoretical tactics had become bloody reality, where friends had died and legends had been born. "They'd appreciate what we're doing here," Harrison replied, "fighting for the soul of the thing they gave their lives for." Ramsey took another sip from the flask. "You know what Willis used to say before every engagement?" Harrison smiled faintly at the memory. He'd tap the side of the turret twice and say, "She feels lucky today, boys." "Every damn time," Ramsey confirmed, "even that last day." The unspoken weight of the memory settled between them. Captain James Willis had died when his tank hit a buried IED during the advance toward Baghdad. His final words over the radio had been, "She feels lucky today, boys." "I saw Reynolds watching the exercise today," Harrison said, changing the subject. "She doesn't look like someone ready to admit defeat." "She's a true believer," Ramsey agreed, "the kind who sees what she expects to see." "No," Harrison shook his head. "She's starting to see the truth. I could tell by the way she was watching. She's realizing that her machines are missing something essential." Below them, Master Sergeant Thompson emerged from Harrison's command tank, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the soft glow of the tactical displays inside. He spotted the two officers on the promontory and made his way toward them, climbing the rocky path with the careful movements of a man who had pushed his body to its limits over the past few days. "Tactical update, sir," Thompson reported as he joined them. "ACS units have established distributed command nodes across their defensive perimeter. They're adapting to the loss of central coordination." Harrison nodded. "As expected, they're learning to operate without their brain." "What about their deployment pattern?" "3 concentric defensive rings, heaviest concentration to the north and east. The western approach is less fortified but heavily mined, according to simulation parameters." "And the southern ravine we used today?" "Completely blocked," Thompson confirmed. "They've positioned multiple units at both ends. That particular rabbit hole is closed." Harrison turned his gaze back to the stars, considering the information. "They're protecting against what they know we can do. The question is, what haven't we shown them yet?" The three men stood in silence for a moment, each lost in his own thoughts about the coming battle. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Harrison said finally, "I want you both to know that this has been one of the greatest privileges of my career. Leading men like you, like Sullivan, like every soldier in this unit, against impossible odds, proving that human judgment still has a place in warfare." Ramsey straightened slightly, his posture unconsciously shifting to military formality. "The privilege has been ours, sir." Thompson nodded in agreement. "Whatever happens tomorrow, they'll remember the Steel Knights." Harrison took one last sip from the flask before returning it to Ramsey. "Get some rest, gentlemen. Tomorrow we make history or become it." As his officers departed, Harrison remained on the promontory, his gaze moving from the stars to the distant lights of the ACS encampment visible on the northeastern horizon. Throughout his long career, he had faced death many times, but never had he felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than now. It wasn't just their lives at stake, but the very nature of the warfare itself. The question of whether humans would continue to make the ultimate decisions on the battlefield or surrender that terrible responsibility to machines. His mind drifted to a memory of his grandfather, a tank commander in Patton's Third Army during World War II, who had once told him, "Tanks aren't just weapons, Billy. They're extensions of the men inside them. A tank without a human heart is just a metal coffin." Harrison wondered what his grandfather would think of the autonomous tanks they faced now. Machines without human hearts, guided only by algorithms and probability calculations. Would he recognize this as warfare or as something fundamentally different? The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Harrison took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air. Whatever philosophical questions hung in the balance, tomorrow would be decided the way all battles ultimately were, by courage, skill, and the will to prevail against all odds. In the ACS Command Center, Dr. Alexis Reynolds sat alone in the soft blue glow of multiple monitors. The temporary structure hummed with the sound of powerful computers processing data from the day's engagement, analyzing the Steel Knights' tactics, and recalculating response patterns for the remaining autonomous units. On the main screen, a simulation played in accelerated time, showing Harrison's tank penetrating the southern ravine and striking at the command center. Reynolds watched it for perhaps the 20th time, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "What were you thinking, Colonel?" she murmured to herself. "A high-risk approach with minimal chance of success. By all logical analysis, you should have failed." She paused the simulation at the moment Harrison's tank fired on the primary command node. The probability calculations had predicted less than an 8% chance of the Steel Knights identifying the true command center location, and an even smaller chance of successfully penetrating the defensive perimeter. Yet they had done both. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Major Lewis, the exercise coordinator, entered with a tablet in hand. "Tomorrow's weather forecast, Doctor," he said, placing the tablet on her desk. "Clear skies. Temperatures expected to exceed 100 degrees by midday." Reynolds nodded absently, her attention still fixed on the frozen image of Harrison's tank. "Have you made a decision about implementing the distributed command protocol?" Lewis asked carefully. "The engineers are standing by." Reynolds finally turned from the screen to face him. "No distributed protocol. We continue as is." Lewis frowned. "With respect, Doctor, without central coordination, the ACS units are operating at reduced capacity. The Steel Knights have already destroyed 27 of our units since the command center strike." "I'm aware of the numbers, Major." Her tone was cool, measured. "This exercise was never about winning or losing. It's about learning." "Learning what exactly?" Reynolds turned back to the screen, studying Harrison's tank with a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. "The limitations of our approach, the capabilities of our opposition, the nature of the human element we're trying to replace." Lewis hesitated before speaking again. "The Joint Chiefs are watching this exercise very closely. If the ACS program suffers a definitive defeat, then we'll have valuable data about its weaknesses," Reynolds interrupted. "Data we wouldn't have obtained otherwise." She gestured to the tablet. "Please inform the engineers that we're proceeding without modification. The autonomous units will continue to operate on distributed control protocols for the final day." After Lewis departed, Reynolds resumed the simulation, watching as Harrison's tank completed its strike on the command center and began its withdrawal. She paused it again and zoomed in on the image of the colonel visible through the commander's hatch. "What will you do tomorrow, Colonel Harrison?" she asked the frozen image. "When all logical approaches have been exhausted, what irrational human solution will you discover?" For the first time since the exercise began, Alexis Reynolds found herself genuinely curious to see what these veteran tank commanders would attempt next. The scientist in her remained committed to the autonomous future her program represented, but somewhere deeper, a part of her that she had long suppressed, the part that had once worn a uniform and made life-or-death decisions in the heat of combat, awakened to the significance of what was unfolding in the desert. Chapter 10, Death Valley. Dawn arrived with a vengeance, the sun surging above the eastern mountains to immediately begin its assault on the desert floor. By thorough 700 hours, the temperature had already climbed past 80 degrees, with projections for midday exceeding 110. Heat waves rippled across the open ground between the two forces, distorting vision and playing havoc with targeting systems. The remaining 11 tanks of the Steel Knights were positioned in concealed locations around the periphery of what the local troops called Death Valley, a vast bowl-shaped depression approximately 5 kilometers across, ringed by rocky ridgelines and cut through with dry washes and ravines. At the northeastern end of the valley, the ACS forces had established their defensive position, their remaining 47 units arranged in concentric circles around their reconfigured command structure. Inside his command tank, Colonel Harrison studied the terrain one final time. The plan they had developed during the night was unorthodox, even by the standards of the past few days. It abandoned conventional armored doctrine so completely that it bordered on tactical heresy. But conventional approaches were a luxury they could no longer afford. "All units, this is command," Harrison spoke into his radio. Final position check. One by one, his remaining tank commanders reported their readiness, their voices steady despite the momentous task that lay before them. They had been divided into 5 elements, 2 tanks each in 4 of the groups, with Harrison commanding 3 tanks in the reserve element. Remember the objective, Harrison reminded them. We're not trying to destroy every ACS unit. We're forcing them to respond to us, to commit their resources according to our timetable, not theirs. Precision and timing are everything. He checked his watch. Operation Broken Mirror commences in 3 minutes. Good hunting, Steel Knights. In the silence that followed, Harrison took a deep breath, centering himself for what was to come. The plan was deceptively simple. Instead of attacking the ACS defensive position directly, they would manipulate the autonomous units into leaving their prepared positions and entering terrain that favored the human commanders. It was a strategy born of desperation, but refined by experience, using the machine's predictable responses against them. 1 minute, Harrison announced. Element Alpha, stand by. Precisely at 0730 hours, 2 tanks under Captain Rodriguez's command emerged from concealment on the western ridge of Death Valley. They advanced in full view of the ACS sensors, moving rapidly down the slope toward the valley floor. Their exposed approach violated every principle of modern tank tactics, presenting themselves as obvious targets for the superior enemy force. The ACS response was immediate. 8 autonomous tanks detached from the outer defensive ring and moved to intercept the approaching threat, their formation spreading out to maximize firing lanes and prevent evasion. Contact, Rodriguez reported calmly. 8 units advancing in standard intercept pattern. Maintain course, Harrison ordered. Execute Phase 1 on my mark. The ACS units closed the distance rapidly, their targeting systems locking onto the 2 exposed Steel Knight tanks. At 2,000 meters, they opened fire, their 120mm main guns sending high-velocity rounds across the valley floor. Now, Harrison commanded. Rodriguez's tanks immediately executed a maneuver that would have been impossible for less experienced crews. Instead of continuing in their advance or attempting to retreat, they pivoted sharply in opposite directions and accelerated at maximum speed parallel to the western ridge, deliberately exposing their flanks to the approaching ACS units. The autonomous tanks, programmed to exploit such a tactical error, adjusted their course to pursue, firing as they moved, but their programming hadn't accounted for what happened next. As the ACS units crossed a seemingly innocuous stretch of terrain, the ground beneath them erupted in a series of controlled explosions. During the night, combat engineers attached to the Steel Knights had placed simulated minefields in carefully selected locations, not where tactical doctrine would suggest, but where Harrison's understanding of the ACS movement algorithms predicted the machines would go. 3 ACS units immobilized, Rodriguez reported, as the simulation registered the effects of the mines. The others are continuing pursuit but slowing to navigate the minefield. Element Bravo, execute, Harrison ordered. On the eastern ridge, Lieutenant Watson's 2 tanks emerged from concealment, mirroring the tactics of Element Alpha. As predicted, the ACS defensive network immediately dispatched another 8 units to intercept this new threat. For the next 30 minutes, the pattern repeated with calculated precision. Each Steel Knight element would appear, draw out a portion of the ACS force, lead them into prepared kill zones where mines, simulated artillery, or concentrated fire from concealed positions would whittle down their numbers, then disappear back into the complex terrain before the autonomous units could effectively respond. By mid-morning, the once orderly ACS defensive formation had been fragmented into smaller pursuit elements scattered across the battlefield, their coordinated defense disrupted by the hit-and-run tactics of the Steel Knights. They're adapting, Ramsey's voice crackled over the radio as his tanks withdrew from their third engagement, starting to anticipate the minefields. Harrison had expected this. The ACS learning algorithms were continuously analyzing patterns and adjusting responses. All elements shift to Phase 2. I repeat, shift to Phase 2. Phase 2 was even more unorthodox than the opening gambit. Instead of continuing to use the same hit-and-run tactics, the Steel Knight elements now executed a complete reversal of approach. They stopped running and turned to directly engage the pursuing ACS units, closing to dangerously close ranges where human intuition and split-second decisions could overcome the machine's calculated responses. The sudden change in tactics temporarily confused the ACS algorithms, creating a critical window of opportunity that the veteran tank commanders exploited ruthlessly. Within 15 minutes, 7 more autonomous tanks had been eliminated, bringing the total ACS losses to 22. But the advantage was short-lived. The remaining ACS units quickly adapted, adjusting their tactical responses to counter the close engagement approach. 3 Steel Knight tanks were destroyed in rapid succession as the machines implemented new firing solutions optimized for close-quarters battle. "Fall back to rally points," Harrison ordered as he monitored the shifting battle dynamics. "Prepare for Phase 3. Phase 3 was the most audacious component of the operation, and the most dangerous. While the other elements had been drawing the ACS units into dispersed engagements across the battlefield, Harrison's reserve element had been carefully making its way through a network of dry washes toward the now thinly defended ACS command position. "Command element sitrep," Harrison requested as his 3 tanks paused in a deep arroyo approximately 1 kilometer from the ACS defensive perimeter. "Perimeter reduced to 12 units," his reconnaissance specialist reported after studying the sensor data. "They've committed over 70% of their force to pursuit operations." Harrison nodded, though no one could see the gesture. It had worked even better than he'd hoped. The ACS network, adapting to each local threat, had failed to maintain strategic awareness of the overall battlefield. "All elements, execute final phase," he ordered. "Draw them to the far side of Death Valley." Across the battlefield, the scattered Steel Knight elements suddenly converged, joining forces to create the appearance of a concentrated assault on the western edge of the valley. The ACS units, programmed to prioritize threats based on force concentration, responded predictably, redirecting their dispersed elements to counter this new development. "They've taken the bait," Thompson's voice confirmed over the command channel. 80% of remaining ACS units converging on western sector. Defensive perimeter down to minimum strength. "Command element, advance," Harrison ordered, his voice calm despite the surge of adrenaline. The 3 tanks under his direct command emerged from the arroyo, accelerating rapidly toward the vulnerable ACS position. The few remaining defensive units immediately engaged, but they were outnumbered for the first time in the exercise. 2 were quickly eliminated, while the others fell back to tighter defensive positions around the reconfigured command nodes. "Command node in sight," Harrison's gunner reported. "Range 800 meters. "Target and fire when ready," Harrison ordered. The main gun roared, sending its high-velocity round directly toward the heart of the ACS command network. The simulation registered a direct hit, but unlike the previous day's engagement, the command structure didn't immediately fail. "Distributed command nodes," Harrison realized aloud. "They've decentralized their control systems. We need to take out all 3 auxiliary nodes." The next 10 minutes developed into an intense close-quarters battle as Harrison's tanks maneuvered around the ACS command position, engaging each identified command node while avoiding fire from the remaining autonomous units. One of Harrison's tanks was destroyed in the exchange, but the other 2 succeeded in neutralizing the auxiliary command nodes one by one. With each successful strike, the coordination of the ACS units across the battlefield noticeably degraded. By the time the final command node was eliminated, the autonomous tanks had reverted to basic programming, their sophisticated tactical adaptability effectively neutralized. "All Steel Knight elements converge on center," Harrison ordered. "Let's finish this." For the first time in the exercise, the scattered human force concentrated its remaining strength in a single decisive thrust. The 8 surviving Steel Knight tanks formed a classic wedge formation and drove directly into the heart of the fragmented ACS position. Without their advanced coordination capabilities, the autonomous tanks fought as individual units, their tactical responses reduced to pre-programmed patterns that the veteran human commanders had spent careers learning to counter. Over the next hour, the balance of power shifted dramatically. "ACS unit down," came the reports one after another. 2 more destroyed on the western flank. 3 neutralized near the central ridge. By early afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The final ACS unit was destroyed at 14:23 hours, bringing the exercise to its conclusion. Of the original 24 Steel Knight tanks, 8 remained operational. They had defeated a force that had outnumbered them 3-1, equipped with technology generations ahead of their own. As Harrison emerged from his commander's hatch, the desert heat hit him like a physical blow. Sweat immediately beaded on his forehead as he surveyed the battlefield from his elevated position. Across the valley floor, the destroyed tanks of both sides sat motionless, their simulation systems indicating the catastrophic damage they had theoretically sustained. In the distance, he could see Dr. Reynolds' command vehicle approaching, a plume of dust rising behind it as it made its way toward the Steel Knight's position. Harrison climbed down from his tank, his joints protesting after hours confined in the commander's seat. The rest of his surviving tank commanders gathered around him, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "Gentlemen," Harrison addressed them, his voice hoarse from hours of issuing commands, "what you've accomplished here will be studied in war colleges for decades to come. You've proven that the human element remains essential to warfare, regardless of technological advancement." "They'll still try to replace us," Sullivan observed, his normally cheerful demeanor subdued by the knowledge of what was at stake. "They'll try," Harrison agreed, "but after today they'll think twice about removing humans from the decision loop entirely." As Reynolds' vehicle pulled up nearby, Harrison straightened his posture and brushed some of the dust from his uniform, a soldier's instinctive response to an approaching superior, ingrained by decades of military discipline. The others followed his example, forming an unconscious line of battle-weary but unbowed warriors. Reynolds stepped out of her vehicle, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the assembled tank commanders. For a long moment, no one spoke, the only sound the whisper of the desert wind and the ticking of cooling engine components. "Congratulations, Colonel Harrison," she finally said, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of genuine respect. "You've accomplished the impossible." "Not impossible, Doctor," Harrison corrected her. "Merely improbable. That's the difference between human judgment and algorithmic calculation. We don't accept the statistical impossibility of success." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I've learned a great deal from this exercise, more than I anticipated." She gestured toward the battlefield where the disabled ACS units sat. "Your tactics were unorthodox." "War is unorthodox," Ramsey interjected. "It's messy, chaotic, and frequently irrational. Qualities your machines struggle to comprehend." Instead of taking offense, Reynolds surprised them with a thoughtful nod. "You're right, Colonel Ramsey. And that's precisely what I'll be including in my report to the Joint Chiefs. This exercise has demonstrated both the remarkable capabilities of autonomous systems and their current limitations." Harrison studied her carefully. "And what will your recommendation be?" A ghost of a smile crossed Reynolds' face. "That we pursue a hybrid approach. Autonomous systems working in conjunction with human commanders, not as their replacement. Your experience, intuition, and moral judgment combined with their processing speed and coordination capabilities." It wasn't a complete victory for the human element, but it was a significant concession from someone who had begun the exercise convinced that the age of human tank commanders was over. "I can live with that," Harrison said, extending his hand. Reynolds accepted the handshake, the gesture symbolizing more than just professional courtesy. It was an acknowledgement that technology and humanity were not inherently opposed, but potentially complementary forces. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Harrison felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had accomplished what they set out to do. The legacy of tank commanders, from his grandfather's generation to his own, would continue evolving with technology rather than being replaced by it. The Steel Knights had proven their worth, not by rejecting progress, but by demonstrating that even in an age of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, the human heart remained the most essential component of the tank. Chapter 11, Echoes of Thunder. 1 week later, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Colonel William Harrison stood at the window of the conference room, watching rain streak down the glass. The weather in Washington couldn't have been more different from the desert heat of Fort Irwin, cool, gray, and relentlessly wet. Distant thunder rumbled, an atmospheric echo of the tank battles still fresh in his memory. Behind him, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and several civilian defense officials were reviewing the final report on Operation Final Verdict. The document, comprehensive, data-heavy, and filled with technical analyses, somehow failed to capture the reality of what had transpired in the Mojave. The sweat, fear, determination, and triumph that had defined those 5 days had been reduced to statistics and clinical observations. Colonel Harrison, the voice of General Maxwell Carter, Army Chief of Staff, drew him back from his reverie. "We'd like your assessment of the exercise outcome." Harrison turned from the window to face the assembled officials. They represented the highest echelons of American military power, men and women responsible for shaping the future of warfare. Their decisions would determine whether the lessons of Fort Irwin would be heeded or ignored. The outcome speaks for itself, General, Harrison replied. 24 tanks with human crews using outdated equipment defeated 72 autonomous units equipped with cutting-edge technology. We did so by exploiting the limitations inherent in algorithmic decision-making. Some would argue that those limitations can be programmed out, interjected Dr. Howard Reeves, the civilian head of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Given enough time and data, autonomous systems could potentially overcome the weaknesses your team exploited. Harrison nodded, acknowledging the point. Perhaps, but they would still lack the fundamental qualities that determine the outcome at Fort Irwin: moral judgment, creative intuition, and the willingness to accept personal risk for strategic gain. Those are uniquely human attributes. Yet human operators also have limitations, noted Admiral Patricia Langdon, the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs. Fatigue, fear, inconsistency in decision-making. The data shows that the ACS units maintain perfect tactical discipline throughout the exercise. Perfect discipline, executing imperfect strategies, Harrison countered. What good is tactical precision in service of strategic error? General Carter leaned forward, his weathered face serious. Colonel, no one is questioning the remarkable achievement of the Steel Knights. The question before us is how to apply the lessons learned. Dr. Reynolds has recommended a hybrid approach. Autonomous systems working in conjunction with human commanders rather than as their replacement. Harrison glanced toward Reynolds, who sat quietly at the far end of the table. Their relationship had evolved from mutual skepticism to cautious respect over the course of the exercise. I support Dr. Reynolds' recommendation, Harrison said. The future of armored warfare isn't in choosing between human or machine, but in finding the optimal integration of both. Tanks with advanced autonomous systems that enhance human capabilities rather than replace human judgment. A murmur of discussion rippled through the room. This was clearly not the hardline stance some had expected from the man who had led the resistance against fully autonomous tanks. To be clear, Harrison continued, I believe human commanders must remain the final authority in any weapon system. The moral weight of warfare cannot and should not be delegated to algorithms, regardless of their sophistication. But I'm not opposed to technology that makes those human commanders more effective. General Carter nodded, seemingly satisfied with this balanced assessment. Thank you, Colonel. Your perspective carries significant weight, given the results at Fort Irwin. The discussion continued for another hour, delving into technical specifications and potential implementation timelines for the hybrid approach. Harrison contributed when asked, but mostly observed, recognizing that the broader strategic decisions were beyond his purview as a field commander. As the meeting concluded, Secretary of Defense Richard Thornton rose from his seat at the head of the table. I want to personally thank Colonel Harrison and the men of the Steel Knights for their exemplary service. What you accomplished at Fort Irwin has fundamentally altered our approach to the future of armored warfare. He crossed to where Harrison stood and extended his hand. The President has asked me to inform you that you'll be receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for your leadership during Operation Final Verdict. Your actions represent the highest traditions of the United States Army. Harrison accepted this handshake with a mixture of pride and humility. The credit belongs to the men who fought alongside me, Mr. Secretary. I merely had the privilege of leading them. As the officials filed out of the conference room, Dr. Reynolds approached Harrison, a tablet computer tucked under her arm. That was gracious of you, she said, supporting the hybrid approach rather than arguing for the status quo. Harrison shrugged slightly. I'm not opposed to progress, Doctor. Just to the assumption that newer always means better, and that human experience is obsolete. Reynolds studied him for a moment, her analytical mind seemingly reassessing her understanding of the man before her. I've been reviewing your service record. 3 wars, multiple decorations, an exemplary career by any standard. Yet you've consistently declined promotion beyond colonel. I belong in a tank, not behind a desk, Harrison replied simply. Some men are meant to be on the front lines. And now, with the hybrid program moving forward, what will you do? Harrison turned back to the window, watching the rain continue its relentless assault on the glass. General Carter has asked me to lead the training program for the new hybrid tanks, ensuring that the human element remains central to their operation. A faint smile crossed Reynolds' face. I can't think of anyone better qualified. She hesitated, then added, I want you to know that I've recommended Master Sergeant Thompson for the Silver Star. What he accomplished against those 30 ACS units was remarkable. He'll appreciate that, Harrison said, though he'd never admit it. As Reynolds departed, Harrison remained at the window, Watching the storm gradually move eastward over the capital, the thunder had faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain against glass. His thoughts drifted to the men of the Steel Knights, Ramsey, Sullivan, Thompson, and all the others who had fought alongside him in that desert crucible. Some would continue their military careers, while others would soon transition to civilian life. But all of them had been part of something historically significant, a pivotal moment in the evolution of warfare. They had proven that even in an age of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons, the human heart remained the most essential element of combat, not because of sentimental attachment to tradition, but because warfare at its core was a human endeavor that required human judgment. As Harrison prepared to leave the Pentagon and return to Fort Irwin, where his new responsibilities awaited, he carried with him not just the knowledge of what they had accomplished, but a renewed sense of purpose. The tank commanders of the future would face challenges he could scarcely imagine, operating machines of unprecedented sophistication. But thanks to what had happened in the desert, they would still be commanders in truth, not merely operators or supervisors of autonomous systems. The soul of the tank, the human element that transformed it from a machine into an instrument of national will, would endure. Chapter 12, Legacy. 3 months later. Fort Irwin National Training Center, California. The desert sun beat down on the parade ground as it had done for countless ceremonies before. Flags snapped in the dry wind, their colors vivid against the backdrop of sand and sky. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, while an assemblage of dignitaries, military officials, and families occupied seating arranged beneath a temporary canopy. Colonel William Harrison, resplendent in his dress uniform with the newly awarded Distinguished Service Medal among his decorations, approached the podium. Before him sat the men of the Steel Knights, the veterans of Operation Final Verdict who had changed the course of American armored warfare. Behind them, arranged in perfect formation, stood the first production models of the M1A4 Abrams, the new hybrid tanks that represented the future they had fought to secure. 3 months ago, Harrison began, his voice carrying across the assembly. 24 tanks and 96 men faced what many considered impossible odds. They were told that their era was ending, that human judgment and experience had been rendered obsolete by technology. They were expected to fail. He paused, surveying the faces before him, weathered, proud, bearing the quiet confidence of men who had proven their worth against all expectations. Instead, they demonstrated the enduring value of the human element in warfare, not through obstinate resistance to progress, but through the creative application of experience, intuition, and moral courage, qualities that no algorithm can replicate. Harrison gestured toward the new tanks behind the assembled soldiers. The M1A4 Abrams represents not the replacement of human commanders, but the enhancement of their capabilities. These machines incorporate the most advanced autonomous systems ever developed, but they remain tools in the hands of skilled professionals, not their substitutes. In the front row, Dr. Alexis Reynolds nodded slightly, her expression one of professional satisfaction. The hybrid program she now directed had incorporated the lessons of Operation Final Verdict, creating a weapons system that leveraged the strengths of both human and machine while minimizing their respective weaknesses. Today, we honor not just those who participated in that historic exercise, but the legacy they preserved, a legacy stretching back to the first tanks that crawled across the battlefields of World War I, a legacy of courage, innovation, and the uniquely human capacity to make moral judgments in the chaos of combat. Harrison turned to address the Steel Knights directly. Gentlemen, what you accomplished will be studied by future generations of tank commanders. You've earned your place in the history of American armored warfare. One by one, he called forward the men who had distinguished themselves during the exercise, presenting awards and commendations. Master Sergeant Thompson received the Silver Star for his stand against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey, Captain Sullivan, and others received appropriate recognition for their contributions to the victory. As the ceremony concluded, Harrison found himself standing beside the lead M1A4, its desert tan paint gleaming in the sunlight. The new tank represented the culmination of everything they had fought for, a machine of unprecedented capability that still required a human heart to direct its power. General Carter approached, his expression approving as he surveyed the new vehicles. Impressive machines, Colonel, a fitting legacy for what you and your men accomplished. Harrison ran a hand along the smooth armor of the turret. The machines are important, sir, but the legacy isn't in the steel. It's in the men who will command them and in the values they'll carry forward. Carter nodded thoughtfully. I understand you'll be retiring next year. 30 years of service is quite a career. It seemed like the right time, Harrison replied. The transition to the new hybrid program is well underway. The next generation of tank commanders is ready to take the reins. Any plans for retirement? Harrison smiled faintly. I've been offered a position at the armor school at Fort Benning, teaching the fundamentals of tank warfare to the next generation, ensuring they understand not just how to operate these new machines, but why the human element remains essential. They couldn't ask for a better instructor, Carter said, extending his hand. Your contribution won't be forgotten, Bill. After the general departed, Harrison remained beside the tank, lost in contemplation. The desert stretched around him, timeless and unchanging, despite the technological revolutions that had swept across it. From his grandfather's Sherman tank to the hybrid Abrams behind him, the fundamental nature of armored warfare had evolved but not transformed. It remained a human endeavor, requiring human judgment and human courage. Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey joined him, the silver oak leaves of his new rank gleaming on his shoulders. Penny for your thoughts, Bill. Harrison gestured toward the horizon. I was thinking about my grandfather. He drove a Sherman across France and Germany, fighting the same kind of battle we simulated here. Man against machine, experience against technology. He would have been proud, Ramsey said, of what you accomplished, of what you preserved. Harrison nodded, accepting the truth of it. The machines will continue to advance. Each generation will face the same question we did. What role should humans play in warfare? I hope they remember the lesson of the Steel Knights. They will, Ramsey assured him, as long as there are men like you to remind them. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Harrison took one last look at the assembled tanks and the men who would command them. He had done what he set out to do, preserved a legacy, not out of blind attachment to tradition, but because it represented something essential about the nature of warfare and the responsibilities of those who waged it. The thunder of the tanks might change in timbre with each technological advancement, but its echo would continue to resonate as long as human hearts guided their power. That was the true legacy of the Steel Knights, not the victory they had won in the desert, but the future they had secured for generations of tank commanders yet to come. In the fading light, the desert wind carried the distant rumble of the new hybrid tanks beginning their training exercises. Their sound a promise that the soul of the tank, the human element that gave it purpose and moral direction, would endure.